one of the concepts, actually, she talks about becoming native. So this has happened to cattails in Indiana, I guess.
Yeah.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
so that's, I don't know. This is not, we're going off script here.
Oh,
so
it's happening.
It's already happening.
No question in.
I know. We're one question in, and I can't help myself. So it's possible, because I think we think of invasive plants as like anything that was not here 1,000 years ago, bad. And the author describes with the white man's footstep, you can become native to a place and do so in a way that is productive and respectful. And so it sounds like kind of cattails to Indiana that has happened. And maybe I don't know, were they an invasive species? Is that possible for something to be invasive but also not terrible?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
So invasive species is a pretty complex issue that a lot of people are diving into, but a lot of what you hear of it is pretty black and white, where it's get rid of it all, or it's how dare you talk to me about cutting this beautiful tree down. So it's usually one or the other extremes, or most of the opinions out there that you hear, but there are several different subsections within the topic of invasive species. And so before a lot of Indiana was actually settled, it was about 90% wetlands. And so this was like prime location for species like cattails. But as urbanization happened and people were like, ooh, this feels like a nice spot, then a lot of those wetlands were covered and dug up and removed to be able to build buildings on it and build infrastructure on it. But even within the subspecies of invasive species, there's this really amazing conversation going on, especially with a lot of indigenous biologists right now. And so Robin Wall-Kimmerer is one of them. One of my mentors, Nicholas Rio, we all have kind of talked together. I've talked to her on the phone, and she's very cool. I've done it. It was once.
Oh, my gosh.
But we've been talking a lot about it because and I think there's a question further on of gratitude and kind of using what's there. And invasive species is a very confusing thing for indigenous scientists because it's presenting itself potentially as an opportunity versus as something that can be taken over. But then it also kind of falls back into what's the management style? Is there one or isn't there one? But then kind of to answer your question, circle back a little bit. I could talk about this forever.
I'm ready.
That's why I'm a naturalist. But there are some species that are classified as just non-native.
Okay.
And so that usually means that they aren't genetically from here, so they haven't always been here and grown with the soil, with the land, but they don't pose as much of a threat, and so they're more or less able to thrive together with other native species versus something like Asian bush honeysuckle. That's one that is kind of just straight invasive because its goal is to just take over everything as much as possible.
Interesting. So you hit the nail on the head. I've always been told if it's invasive species, it's bad, get rid of it, don't. But now there's this subclassification. Well, if it's not really, so it's the classification is less where it came from and more, well, how harmful is it to where it is? Yeah,
especially with a ton of invasive species getting a lot more recognition, and including there's a terrestrial plant law within Indiana where I think it's over 40 species have been banned from being sold or planted within Indiana. Don't raise your hand if you don't know it and you know what's in your yard right now.
Yeah, this is recorded.
This is recorded and live, everyone. But there is this plant law where different nurseries aren't allowed to more or less sell these specific plants anymore. I
had no idea.
Yeah, but because there's all of those ones, like you kind of have a scale of, well, this is horrible, this is the worst thing ever, to like, this is kind of okay. And so there's a big prioritization that happens with invasive species removal.
Oh, okay. So, okay. I don't want to get too off topic. And we can talk about invasive species later because I'm very interested in invasive species. But that's really interesting. I had no idea that there was like whole subclassifications and it seems like this science is getting ahead of the messaging a little bit, because I mean it's still very black and white, so that's great to hear that maybe we're learning to live with the mistakes we've made, which is something this book also talks about.
And there's actually, for anyone wanting to come to Bloomington tomorrow, there's a invasive species pull and creek cleanup in one of my parks, just throwing that out.
If you're watching and you're in Bloomington,
Jackson Creek Park, 1 p.m. But we were talking about management styles, and a lot of invasive species removal is get in there, get the roots. Trying really hard.
You're in a good Midwest audience. You're safe here.
You can get the roots, and you basically just kind of leave this giant hole. But we are on a edge of a creek, and so if you're leaving this giant hole and disturbing the soil, you're also now opening up the creek to a whole bunch of erosion. And so I'm trying this management strategy of just continuously cutting some of these plants, but leaving the roots and the skeleton of the plant there to help with bank erosion. And so I'm working on, for anyone that's read the book, practicing that living together with nature, and saying, well, this is technically an invasive species, but can it help me in one way or another?
Yeah. Kind of use it to your advantage the best you can. Yeah, that's really interesting. So if you're in Bloomington, hopefully it's a little warmer out for y'all tomorrow. This might be a little too much.
And if it doesn't work, it's not my idea.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. A lot of research has gone into it.
Well, and I'm so glad you talk about, the research that went into this, because I think the author, especially in the beginning, does a really good job of talking about really this push and pull between the science brain wants you to look at something, especially plants and nature, in this really narrow lens and really not consider anything outside of that. But then there's this cultural pull that you consider plants as an individual, and you consider their autonomy, and you respect them in a way that maybe science doesn't. And I especially loved her story about going to college and being told, like, yeah, that shouldn't be why you want to do this. That's like, you don't belong here for feeling that way, which is absolutely not true. But I mean, especially for women, and especially, women of color, Indigenous women, I mean, it's a tactic used to keep people out of science. And so I'm curious if you've experienced that push and pull, and that, like, I'm assuming you have, and based on your reaction.
My whole life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gosh. So, I mean, if you want to, did you feel similarly to how the author did? Like, did that really resonate with you?
Oh, yeah. I am not ashamed to admit that I had to close the book a few times and just sit in my feels.
Same.
That's the booze part of books and booze. No.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. But, yeah, it really hit almost every kind of major event within my life.
Wow.
And so I actually, it was a huge, I guess, accident of where I went to school. So I got an email one day from Dartmouth College saying, hey, there's this Native American program here. We're trying a fly-in program. Do you want to come out? And I was like, this seems real. And so sent an email and applied, and then like a month later I got on a plane by myself for the first time, and somehow my parents were okay with that. And they're like, you're going to New Hampshire? That seems fine too. And so it was a big happy accident, but I had my heart set in high school, not to go way back, but in high school I was really into hard science, I was really into engineering, and so I had my heart set on being a mechanical engineer. This would have been weird to work with an engineering firm. But within my first semester, I knew, I was like, this is not for me.
Yeah.
And I really didn't want to go into environmental studies or science because where I'm from, that's just kind of the norm. Like, I grew up doing volunteer work at the Boundary Waters, at the headwaters of the Mississippi, and that was just like a casual Saturday for me. And so I was like, that's boring. Everyone does that. I don't want to go into the environmental thing. That feels like I'm cheating. But then I kind of stopped being stubborn for maybe like a month. of my life, and
That's all it takes.
yeah. And then I ended up going into environmental studies, where I got super into just the human and nature interactions, because it really fit in well with my just upbringing, being in a pretty traditional area, and it just made sense to me of trying to figure out how we can get people and nature to interact well together. But similar to what Robin was describing with her advisor, I was still kind of slowly exiting the engineering field. And so I was saying, but what about people, though? People are kind of cool, right? And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Machines, way better. And so I kind of had that weird pull where I was like, I'm not sure if this is right to do. And then even once I got into the environmental field, I felt that just kind of with a lot of, I guess, press around different types of majors, that hard science was what was going to like get me out into the world and was going to make a difference. And so throughout my entire time in college, I was on this fence of doing a lot of education work, because that's where my passion is in environmental education. But then at the same time, I just finished up a 5-year-long climate change study on maple syrup.
Oh my gosh.
And so I was still
Congrats.
like, yeah, thank you. My blood type is grade B. And so I was really stuck on that, like, do I do hard science, or is it really lame to, go out into nature and say, who wants to look at this tree? Which it's not lame. But
Definitely not.
But even after I graduated college, I was still struggling with that. And I ended up working for Point Reyes National Seashore in Northern California, and I was a fisheries biologist. And so I got to play with fish in the stream all day long. Yeah. I got to put on a giant wetsuit because the water in California is cold, but everything else is really hot.
Really?
And so and it's kind of a sidebar, but our classification for snorkeling, we had to snorkel these streams in a drought, was that they had to be 3 centimeters deep, so deep enough to stick like half of your eyeball in and be able to count. And so
Okay.
I'm on a lot of tourist videos, belly crawling through some drought-stricken streams looking for fish with like one goggle in. And even then I was like, science is really cool.
You're like, this is great.
I was like, this is great. But at the end of the day, I was having this really great time and really wanted to stay, but there was something that was still missing, and it was that I didn't have anyone to share what we were doing with, or share that information with. And so I kind of made the decision to go to tropical Indiana and work as a naturalist.
Yep. Known for our beaches.
It's true. Well, I heard some like, ooh. And before California, I actually worked in Hawaii with sea turtles and still chose Indiana. So you can add to the oohs.
We're adding to the questions.
Yes. But it wasn't until I got here that I realized there is still that kind of stigma with no matter which culture you're from or which area you're in or what field you're working in, there's still this like capital T truth, and that is often with hard science. So if someone can say this hard science backs it up, then that is the truth. Whereas what Robin describes super well and kind of what matches well with what I grew up learning and what I try to integrate into a lot of my nature programs is that there are all forms of capital T truths. And so she shares a lot of stories, and even with like maple syrup, there was a story of like my culture, my people, Anishinaabe, went out into the woods and a tree limb broke and just like came gushing out a whole bunch of like super sweet syrup, and everyone was like, this is the best, and laid under the tree and let it fill up their mouths and then couldn't move because they ate too much. Word for word. Not paraphrasing at all. But within that story, it's really interesting because I get to see not only from a traditional standpoint of like, oh, so, we got in trouble because we just kind of overconsumed and couldn't leave the forest floor. And so the trees got mad and we're like, now you have to work for it and you have to boil 40 gallons of raw sap just to get 1 gallon of syrup now.
Wow, it's 40 to 1.
It
I didn't
is.
realize that.
Most of the time. If you're tapping the right things. But so like there's that part of it, and to me that's a truth where it's like, yeah, absolutely, those trees are very sassy. They have a lot to say. But at the same time, there's also the truth of there was a like shift in the climate that made like the tree sap different, or the trees, you don't like stick a hole into a maple tree and then out comes the super slow, thick, grade B blood type I have. It's just kind of like water. And so you can look at science and say, oh, well, the tree absorbs water from the ground, creates a little bit of sugar to help like feed and get the leaves ready. And on both ends, both of those are true. And so, like Robin was saying a lot, I kind of throughout my life and my career have always gone back and forth with the like, how do I describe this in a way that someone will be like, oh, yes, I understand, that is true. But now I'm kind of, honestly, after this book, I'm kind of now working more at, well, here are just all of the different things that can be equated to one event in nature, for example.
Yeah, and you know, I was gonna talk about this later, but I think it's a really nice segue into, you know, she talks about some of her experiences in education, especially you mentioned you love education, and that's a passion of yours. She talks about how hard it is for her to really bring that to the table and get that across to students, especially students who maybe don't seem receptive. And I mean, you probably experience that on the regular. So, I mean, have you found a way to maybe impart that, or can you? Like, are people generally receptive, or what is your experience with that?
Well, I'm pretty amazing, so. No.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So it's very easy. No.
Miss Hawaii.
It has been pretty difficult, especially when you're going into a school. And for me, I go into a lot of schools, and usually they're like elementary science classes or even high school science classes, and they're like, here's our AP exam. Describe all of these things. Tell me how cattails breathe underwater. And it can be difficult because in a lot, especially now, which is super great, a lot of the classrooms have kids that go home and have different stories associated with why things are the way they are in nature. Even if you go at kind of cute storyline of like, here's why, you know, this crane has long legs. It's because someone pulled on them really hard, and whoops, now they all look like that. I don't know if that's a real child's book, but
Probably somewhere.
TM. And so it's kind of hard to, or I guess it's definitely a challenge to go out, and if there is like a child or even an adult in one of my programs that something like this made up why the crane has long legs, if that really sticks with them, I try really hard to tell them, like, yes, if that is how you're going to remember it, like, can absolutely be a truth. Like, let's keep going on to it. How else do you think things happen? And it really helps me bring it back to doing a lot of observational learning.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how I've found the best way to integrate all types of knowledge, and just, what do you see? How do you think that happened?
Yeah, when I like that for all types of knowledge, because you're right, there is the natural sciences, the hard sciences, big capital T truth, anything else up for debate.
Yeah. And
like, that's not really how anything works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's and I think part of it maybe is ego, but I mean, listen, some of it might be ego, but I mean, you're right, there are other truths, and you would be, I think, better off. I mean, you're richer for experiencing that and learning that. And I think, if you know, going through this book, I was definitely appreciative of some of the stories that she shares, and she even notes that, like, she doesn't share all of the stories that you know, like, that have been passed down to her, but I'm very appreciative of the ones she did, because they were very moving.
Yeah absolutely. And even something that was new for me in Indiana, and I know technically Bloomington's not southern Indiana, but I don't know.
It's in that direction.
Apologies, Bloomington viewers.
All one of them.
But there are a lot of kids, still talking about the school example, but I do work with a lot of adults. Actually, I mostly work with adults. But those kid stories of kids stick out the most because they're wild.
Fun.
They're fun. Fun, they say, is wild things. But something that was very new to me, and I actually used to work for the Science Museum in Bloomington, that you would, I guess I had a demonstration that I would do, kind of like a science class with school groups that would come in, and one was about evolution. And there would be a lot of very religious kids that would come in, and you'd kind of ask them questions like, why do you think this snake doesn't have legs? How did it get this way? And they would immediately, and be very, very proud of it, just shout out a very, I guess, stereotypical like answer associated with whatever religion they grew up or are growing up in. And so that was kind of where I had to start doing that navigation, because I'm not going to tell a 7-year-old that's wrong. Boo. That's just,
I mean, you could.
It's true.
But
That's not my teaching style.
Yeah.
I don't want to scar them for life.
Fair.
But that was kind of where that shift for me started happening too.
Interesting.
And seeing that, well, there are a lot of other upbringings that I don't know if that's capital T truth or not. And so we can work on that together and share all of these observations and see what's in common with them.
Yeah, and when you can still appreciate other people's capital T truth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not all or none. It's not black and white.
Yeah.
If the invasive species aren't, you are evolved. You can figure it out.
Yeah. Yes. Oh no, we're back to invasives.
I'm coming back to them. Okay, we can get away from the invasives. You mentioned maybe when we were talking prior to us starting this culture of gratitude, and maybe that's another capital T truth that was broken down really well in the book, especially in the Honorable Harvest and Allegiance to Gratitude chapters. And she shares other vignettes throughout the book and in other chapters, and really highlights how we as a culture do not consume in a culture of gratitude, and we really do not feel this obligation to reciprocity to the land and to the giver that she reflects that her indigenous culture really prioritizes, and that is a capital T truth for her. But it just, for us, I say us as in like a settler, descendant,
An invasive.
And we're an invasive
species.
I consider myself an entire species. And so this kind of takes us to our turn and talk, because I think this is probably better facilitated in a group, which, if you are new here, our turn and talks are where you quite literally turn and quite literally talk to those around you, if you would like, which I hope you participate. And so where basically I will give you a question, I'll give you like 10-ish minutes. We will continue talking to the and we'll come back after 10-15 minutes and we can share some of the things you talked about. So my question for you that I would like for you to turn and do the talkings, more broadly speaking, we can embrace a culture of gratitude in the context of consumption. And so like by consumption I mean like, the author talks about, we go to the grocery store, we buy the package of pre-cut watermelon, bring it home, eat it. I'm not thinking about where it was grown and the land it was taken from and, the soil that it took and the time and the care and that it took to put that on my table. And maybe you think about it like, for example, at Thanksgiving, which we talked about the Thanksgiving address. Maybe that's like the one time maybe you're not even thinking about the land. And the author even highlights, you can go out of your way to like really shop sustainably, really go to the farmers markets where it's locally, sourced, and you're still just are culturally, we are not wired, and our processes and our infrastructure around consumption just does not value gratitude. And so for your turn and talk, I would like for you to discuss, maybe individual ways and maybe broader ways that we can embrace a culture of gratitude, and maybe even reciprocity, ways that you can, reciprocate, even if, your fruit was grown somewhere in California. You can still reciprocate to the land, just maybe not that land. So, I'll give you probably 10-ish minutes, maybe 15 if y'all are chatting up a storm. I don't mind giving you a couple extra minutes. And then we can come back and y'all can share with us some of the interesting ideas, because I feel like you guys are very creative. So we can come back in like 10, 15 minutes. Okay?
We
Thank
have
you.
high hopes.
Yeah. Y'all are.
Land. What can you do here? It's like, ooh.
Well, no, I mean, because I mean, that it feels
That's a
to
thought
me.
to chew on.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It feels to me like, you know what? I thought about that literally yesterday. I was chopping up vegetables. I'm on this terrible diet, and I'm eating a lot of vegetables. No, and I'm eating a lot of squash, and you chopping the ends and whatever, and I'm looking at these pieces, and I'm like, I could just compost. I can compost it and put it in my garden. I
Yeah.
don't really need compost right now, though, and I don't want the squirrels getting in my green bean bed. Not again. And so I was thinking to myself, and I was like, I don't want to throw this away. And so I threw it out in the front yard, and I'm, watching squirrels pick at it, birds pick at it. And it just made me think of this book. And like you talked about putting it down. And I mean, I cried.
I did.
I'm like a little baby. I don't know what it is. I'm not even a mom. I'm crying about her talking about being a mom. I was like, what? She just hit me in so many ways. And I'm thinking, I can't give back to Pasadena, California, or wherever, in Mexico or in Canada, wherever all these produce is. I'm not going to go there, and and also the travel and the greenhouse gas emission. It's not worth it. But what can I do? The Midwest produces so much produces so much produce. Yeah. for the rest of the world. I can give back to even if it's just my little plot, or if it's, I feel like I can do something. She talked about reciprocity in a very literal sense. Like I pulled the vegetable from here. I gathered from here. I took from here, so I need to give back to here. But for the average American, that's just not going to happen. So how can you give back, even if it's just locally? I mean,
yeah, I think one thing that I tend to hear, like a lot of people gravitate towards, is the definition of giving back has to be directly to nature and the land, but often people forget that people are a part of that. And so
interesting.
And so I've had those exact same thoughts too, where like, love me some mangoes do not grow here.
Yeah.
But if I'm ordering, this hasn't happened, but hypothetically, if I'm ordering a whole like crate of mangoes, then one way I can give back is by literally giving it to the people around me that maybe have never had a mango or just also really like mangoes. And so that kind of adds that cycle of gratitude between human species and human species, instead of straight to the like dirt species and human species.
I had never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, people. So you see people as part of,
Yeah.
this. I guess I don't want to call it a cycle, but I mean it's a family, a group. I don't know how to refer to that.
Yeah. I don't know how to refer to it either.
This collective bag of life that is on this marble.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess we are a part of. So I guess giving back to others can be a way of, but it's still expressing that gratitude.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're still getting the gist without. Maybe part of it's the hyperfixation, and I mean, she talks about this in other areas. And I definitely think it's a colonial settler mindset. You hyperfixate on the one thing.
Yeah.
And everything else, your brain just cannot compute.
Yeah.
And so that has to be a settler thing. It has to be.
Yeah. I see it a lot in the like invasive species talks. Which we have a whole group dedicated in Bloomington to identifying and eradicating them.
Nice.
And I see so many people get tunnel vision on like they're just out in the woods and they're just ripping and pulling and they're like, we did it, we're gotten rid of it, which is still a great thing, but the whole time they're missing the like larger picture of like, when I'm removing this piece from this spot, how am I taking care of this spot now that's empty? Like, what do I do with
Yeah.
that? Do I just pull things in my upbringing? Because even in my language, in my tribal language, we don't have inanimate words.
Okay.
And so things like the dirt or bread or people are all animate, so they're all seen as living things.
Even dirt.
And so
Yeah.
that's kind of my outlook on, we want to respect the rock the same way